The second F-4 climbed out of Shiraki and leveled at altitude, its afterburners already shut down. The backseater watched the radar scope tighten on a return 12 o'clock high, range 27 nautical miles, closing at 150 knots. Through the canopy, the crew saw only a single bright light at first, then the light resolved into a rectangle of flashing strobes. Blue, green, red, orange, steady against the dark sky north of the city glow. The pilot held the nose up and the throttle steady while the distance closed. At roughly 10 nautical miles, a second smaller light broke away from the main object and came straight in. The pilot reached for the missile select switch on the weapons panel. The panel went dark. UHF and intercom died at the same instant. The smaller light kept coming, no change in speed or altitude visible against the night horizon. The pilot rolled the Phantom into a hard -G turn. The light followed inside the arc, passed, then reversed and climbed back to rejoin the rectangular formation. The primary return stayed on the same bearing. Once the turn was complete and the distance began to open, the instruments and radios came back online. A third light then left the main object, descended toward the ground, and settled near the edge of the city, casting a bright glow across 2 or 3 kilometers of terrain. The F-4 remained at altitude, radar still painting the primary return. In daylight, a helicopter lifted off to search the area where the third light had come down. Its crew reported a steady beeper signal near a small house with a dry garden. Residents there said they had heard a loud noise and seen a bright flash like lightning the previous night. The report pages that reached the Joint Chiefs carried these observations in sequence, with no further commentary on the objects themselves. At 12:30, the phones began ringing at the Imperial Iranian Air Force Command Post. 4 separate callers from the Shemiran district, north of the city, described a bright object that held steady while stars drifted and aircraft lights crossed the sky at normal speeds. The duty officer wrote each report on the log sheet, noting time and location, then rang Mehrabad Tower. The tower confirmed no known traffic matched the descriptions. Brigadier General Yousefi stepped out of the building into the cool night air. The object shone brighter than any star visible that hour. It remained fixed against the horizon while other lights moved. The Alborz range stood dark to the north, and the city glow lay south. Yousefi returned inside and ordered an F-4 scrambled from Shiraki Air Base near Hamadan. The jet lifted off the runway under clear conditions and turned east. Its navigation lights showed against the dark slopes as it climbed toward the Tehran area. On the ground, the command post kept the log open beside the telephone. Mehrabad Tower continued to report no scheduled flights in the sector. The F-4 maintained its heading, instruments steady, the night horizon visible through the canopy as the aircraft closed the distance. The F-4 climbed out of Shiraki and settled on a heading toward Tehran. Below the wings, the night was clear, the Alborz ridges showing as darker bands against the horizon. City glow from the capital spread across the southern edge of the view, and the crew kept the radar in search mode while the aircraft leveled at intercept altitude. At long range, the object appeared on the scope as a steady return. The pilot continued the closure, watching the distance count down through the navigation display. At roughly 25 nautical miles, the reported contact was still ahead of the aircraft, but the cockpit systems failed together. The report does not describe one gauge failing first and another later. It gives the crew the whole loss at once. Instrumentation gone, UHF gone, intercom gone, leaving the 2 men with a bright object ahead and no useful way to talk to each other or the ground. The pilot held the aircraft long enough to register that this was not a single bad radio call or one loose instrument. He banked the fighter away from the bearing. As the nose swung and the range began to open, the systems returned. Once the aircraft was no longer closing on the object, both instrumentation and communications worked normally again. The crew made no further attempt to close. They turned for Shiraki, reported the sequence of failures once they were back in contact with the tower, and were ordered to land without another try at the object. On the ground, the mission report was written in the standard format and passed to the command post. The pages recorded the exact distance at which the systems dropped, the fact that radar contact had been maintained until the turn, and the clean recovery once the aircraft moved away. No further intercept order was issued to that crew. The second F-4 left the runway at Shiraki and climbed into the same dark corridor the first aircraft had just vacated. Below the wings, the lights of Tehran spread in a loose grid, broken by the darker band of the mountains to the north. In the rear cockpit, the weapons officer kept his eyes on the radar scope while the pilot held a steady intercept heading. At 27 nautical miles, the return appeared, high at 12 o'clock, closing at roughly 150 knots. The scope showed a clean, consistent paint with no breakup or side lob interference. The pilot confirmed the contact on his own display and continued the approach. Outside the canopy, the object resolved first as a single, intense white light against the night horizon. As the range dropped below 20 miles, the light separated into a rectangular arrangement of flashing points, blue, green, red, and orange, each strobe sharp enough to leave a brief afterimage on the plexiglass. No steady red or green navigation lights appeared, and no transponder return registered on the IFF interrogator. The formation maintained its relative position to the fighter without drift or change in aspect as the closure continued. Inside the cockpit, the only illumination came from the dimmed instrument panels and the faint glow of the radar screen. The radar remained locked through the next several miles, the range gate holding steady and the signal strength unchanged. The crew cross-checked the visual bearing against the scope, both matched. Below them, the city glow thinned as they moved north of the built-up area, and the darker slopes of the Albors began to rise toward the nose. The lock held without break or warning tone. At the Air Defense Command Post, the earlier telephone calls from Shemaran residents had already been logged and passed to the tower. The first F-4's reported loss of instruments and communications at roughly the same distance was noted on the status board. Yet the second aircraft's systems continued to function normally. The radar return stayed solid on the scope while the rectangular pattern of lights remained fixed in the forward view. The crew kept the intercept geometry constant, closing the distance under the same steady radar presentation that had first appeared at 27 nautical miles. The second F-4 held the lock at 27 nautical miles, the rectangular return steady on the scope, while the crew watched the light itself through the windscreen. City glow from Tehran lay below and behind them, a dull wash against the darker horizon. The primary object showed as a single intense source with rapid strobe flashes cycling through blue, green, red, and orange in a fixed rectangular pattern. No navigation lights or standard aircraft beacons matched the sequence. At roughly 10 nautical miles, the return on the scope split. A smaller distinct echo detached from the main return and moved directly toward the fighter. The pilot reached for the weapons control panel and selected the AIM-9 station. At the moment of selection, the panel indications dropped to blank. UHF and intercom both cut out in the same instant, leaving only the rush of air across the canopy and the low turbine sound through the airframe. The smaller return continued its track without any visible change in speed or heading. The pilot rolled into a hard -G turn, pulling the nose down and across to break the closing line. The smaller object followed the same arc inside the fighter's radius, closing to a point where it passed beneath the left-wing root before reversing its own path. The crew watched it move back toward the primary light, still visible as a separate return until the two merged again on the scope. Throughout the turn, the canopy remained clear, the night horizon and scattered ground lights sliding past in the same steady motion as any other defensive maneuver. Once the separation opened past roughly 10 nautical miles, the weapons control panel lit again, and the UHF and intercom circuits returned. The primary return stayed on the scope at the original bearing, and the visual light remained in the same relative position, still flashing its rectangular pattern. No further separation occurred during the next several minutes of continued observation. The crew kept the lock and maintained visual contact while the aircraft remained in the same general altitude block. The radar continued to show the single large return without another reported split. Ground references and the city lights below stayed constant, and the tower did not give the crew an ordinary traffic match for what they were chasing. The crew held position long enough to confirm that both the primary light and its radar return remained present before the sequence moved into its next stranger phase. The F-4 held its orbit above the city glow, the rectangular formation of colored lights still fixed 12 o'clock high on the radar scope. The smaller object that had broken away remained visible through the canopy, a distinct point of light against the darker mass of the primary source. Then the point began to drop. It moved straight down, no arc, no drift, descending at a rate the crew later described as controlled rather than falling. The pilot kept the aircraft level at altitude and watched the light sink toward the ground below the northern suburbs. As it neared the surface, the light did not flare or streak. It simply continued until it appeared to stop just above or on the terrain. Moments later, a bright white illumination spread outward from that point. The crew estimated the lit patch covered 2 to 3 kilometers across, bright enough to stand out against the scattered street lighting and the dark stretches between districts. The glow held steady rather than pulsing or fading quickly. No secondary flash, no rising dust column, and no visible impact signature reached the cockpit. The primary rectangular light remained overhead the whole time, unchanged in position relative to the city. The backseater noted the approximate bearing and distance from Mehrabad's known runway layout, marking the spot on the kneeboard while the pilot kept the aircraft's nose pointed generally toward the area. The F-4 stayed at altitude, systems still operating after the earlier lock-on, and the crew continued to monitor both the ground illumination and the larger light above. No further separation occurred. After several minutes, the ground light began to diminish, though the crew did not report an exact time when it went out. They turned back toward Sharaki with the position noted for the debrief. The same report that carried these observations also recorded that a civilian airliner inbound to Mehrabad had experienced radio difficulties in the same general area that night, though the airliner crew made no visual sighting. Later, daylight helicopter checks were flown over the marked coordinates. One pass picked up a brief beeper signal near a cluster of small houses with dry garden plots. Residents there stated they had heard a loud noise and seen a bright flash the previous night, but no physical traces were recovered or logged beyond the signal itself. The second F-4 turned back toward Mehrabad once the smaller object had rejoined the primary light. The crew kept the city glow ahead and the dark ridge lines of the Alborz to their right. At roughly 25 miles out, the UHF radios began to break up. Static rose and fell in the headsets without any change in altitude or power setting. The inertial navigation system started to drift, its heading numbers sliding a few degrees each time the aircraft crossed the same magnetic bearing from the airport. When the pilot banked slightly off that line, the instruments steadied. When he corrected back onto it, the fluctuations returned. Inside the cockpit, the panel lights stayed steady, but the intercom between front and rear seat cut in and out. The radar scope showed only ground return and the familiar runway layout at Mehrabad. No further blips appeared. The pilot held the same heading long enough to confirm the pattern, then flew a wider arc that kept the aircraft clear of the affected bearing until final approach. A civilian airliner inbound to Mehrabad that same night crossed the identical sector. Its crew also lost radio contact with the tower. The loss lasted only while the airliner remained on that bearing. Once it turned onto the approach course, the radios returned. The airliner pilots logged the outage, but reported no lights or radar contacts. The F-4 touched down without further systems trouble. Ground crews met the jet on the ramp. The pilot and weapons officer climbed out, handed over their kneeboard notes, and walked into the operations building where the earlier telephone reports from Shemaren residents were already stacked on a desk. The written summaries described the same sequence of lights and the same loss of communications on the return leg. The following morning, a helicopter lifted off from Mehrabad and flew the reported track of the object that had dropped away from the primary light. The crew worked the emergency beacon receiver across standard distress frequencies while the aircraft courted the ground east of the city. At one low pass, the signal came up steady, a clear electronic tone pulsing through the headset. They circled the source and set down near a small house bordered by a dry garden plot of turned earth and low stone walls. The crew stepped out into the morning light and walked the immediate perimeter with handheld counters. No needle movement rose above normal background. They checked the reported coordinates on their map against the visible terrain and found nothing scorched or displaced. The soil showed no indentations or residue. Residents at the house told the crew they had been inside when a loud report shook the windows and a bright flash lit the yard like lightning, though the sky had been clear. The helicopter team noted the time the witnesses gave and compared it to the period when the second F-4 had watched the smaller object descend. They walked the garden rows and the dirt track leading to the road, looking for any fragment or burn mark the night's light might have left. Nothing appeared. The beeper remained audible on the aircraft receiver, but grew fainter as they moved farther from the plotted spot. After an hour, the crew climbed back aboard, lifted off, and continued a wider sweep along the same bearing without picking up additional signals or ground traces. The pages later filed at the airbase recorded the beacon detection, the house location, the residents' account of the noise and flash, and the absence of debris or elevated radiation readings. The report pages reached Washington inside a folder that carried the incident sequence in order. 4 telephone calls had come into the Iranian Air Force command post from residents in the Shemiran district, each describing an object that hovered and then moved with sudden changes in brightness. The same folder recorded how the duty officer passed the calls to Mehrabad Tower, how the general on watch stepped outside to look, and how he then directed an F-4 from Cherokee Air Base to intercept. The first aircraft's write-up noted the loss of UHF and intercom at roughly 25 nautical miles, along with the complete blanking of cockpit instruments and the return of those systems once the pilot reversed course. The second aircraft's account followed immediately, radar lock acquired at 27 nautical miles, 12 o'clock high, with the target closing at about 150 knots. The visual description listed an intensely brilliant light showing strobe-like flashes in blue, green, red, and orange arranged in a rectangular pattern. Further pages described the smaller object that separated and closed on the F-4, the attempted selection of an Amion 9 that coincided with the sudden failure of the weapon's control panel and the radios, and the smaller object's path as it tracked the fighter's defensive turn before rejoining the primary light. Another entry covered the object that left the main light, descended, and settled near the ground while illuminating an area 2 to 3 kilometers across. A separate note mentioned a civilian airliner that lost communications on the same bearing while approaching Mehrabad. The daylight follow-up was summarized on the next sheet. A helicopter crew detected a steady beeper signal near a small house with a dry garden. Residents there described a loud noise and a bright flash like lightning during the night. The packet closed with a routing slip dated 8 December 1978 that carried the material through DIA evaluation channels. Later review sheets attached to the same file listed possible misidentification of astronomical objects, equipment faults during night intercepts, or radar ambiguity with ordinary traffic, yet those sheets also recorded that none of the proposed explanations accounted for the simultaneous loss of independent systems on 2 separate aircraft at measured ranges from the reported object. The pages remained in that order inside the Joint Chiefs of Staff file. The first F-4 climbed out of Shiraki and leveled toward Tehran under a clear September sky. Panel lights glowed steady across the cockpit until the range closed to 25 nautical miles. At that point, the report gives the same abrupt cluster of failures, instrumentation, UHF, and intercom. The pilot turned back, and the systems restored as soon as the nose swung away from the bearing. A second F-4 launched minutes later and acquired a radar return at 27 nautical miles, 12 o'clock high. The return closed at roughly 150 knots. Through the windscreen, the crew saw an intensely bright light carrying 4 colored strobes, blue, green, red, orange, in a rectangular pattern. When a smaller bright object separated and moved toward the fighter, the pilot reached for the AIM-9 selector. The weapons control panel and radios failed at the same instant. He rolled into a defensive turn. The smaller object followed inside the turn, then rejoined the primary light. A third object left the main source, descended, and settled near the ground, casting illumination across 2 to 3 kilometers of terrain. A commercial airliner inbound to Mehrabad reported radio failure in the same area, though its crew saw nothing. The command post logged the 4 initial citizen calls from the Shemiran district, the scramble order, and the successive system failures. The radar scope showed no further returns after the second F-4 withdrew. At first light, a helicopter lifted from Mehrabad and homed on a beeper signal near a small house with a dry garden. Residents there described a loud noise and a lightning-like flash the previous night. The packet records the times, ranges, and system states on its pages, followed by the routing slip dated December 1978. No additional intercepts or ground follow-ups appear in the preserved documents.